Sri Aurobindo is not a new name in this part of the country, thanks to the efforts done by Dr. Chaudhary and his wife Bina and his colleagues during the last 3 decades. I remember how in the a little before 1950, I believe, this institute was started, I believe, with the munificence of Gainsborough. Is Gainsborough, yeah. And Sri Aurobindo received a letter asking whom he would recommend to represent his philosophy, his teaching at this institute, which was to develop interest in Asian studies, particularly Gandhi and Sri Aurobindo. And Sri Aurobindo himself suggested the name of Dr. Haridas Chaudhary, who had just won a gold medal from the University of Calcutta for his excellent thesis on Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. And he came, and we are all familiar with the solid work that has been done in putting Sri Aurobindo on the map, as they say. There are other parts of the country where I have been traveling, where Sri Aurobindo is very little known. They scratch their heads and say, I think there was a Hindu philosopher who spoke of evolution. That's all that they know. It's a pity, because both in Europe and in Asia, Sri Aurobindo's contribution to the 20th century trend of human evolution has been highly assessed. In the East, he was the first seer of note to give a positive direction to human seeking. All along, the religious or the spiritual or the cultural seeking in the East has been more or less otherworldly, deprecating life in this world, devaluing effort, human effort, and calling upon the human to withdraw and merge in the reality, whether one calls it Brahman, taking it in its positive sense, or Nirvana in the negative sense. Sri Aurobindo was the first thinker to propound a philosophy in the first decade of the present century, calling attention to the fact that matter is Brahman. Brahman, as you know, is the classical Indian name for the reality turned towards manifestation. As related to this universe, the reality is called Brahman. So he called attention to a very ancient dictum in the Upanishads that matter is Brahman. He recounted the story from the Upanishads, wherein it is described how the son of a sage, Varuna, comes to his father and says, "Father, may I know the eternal? May I know Brahman?" The father approves of his quest and tells him, "Go and concentrate and find out that from which all things have come into being, by which they are sustained and into which they pass in their ending." The boy does likewise, and after a period of time he comes back and tells, "Father, I have found Brahman." Father looks at him questioningly, and the boy answers, Matter is Brahman, for out of matter all things are born, in matter they are sustained, and in the universal matter they are dissolved." The father nods but tells him, "Go back and find out further." The boy follows the injunction and comes back saying, "Father, I have found Brahman." "What's that?" He says, "Life energy, prana, is Brahman, because from life energy all creatures come into being. By life energy all are sustained, and into the universal ocean of life energy they are dissolved." The father sends him back again. So 3 times more the boy goes and comes back with his discovery each time. Matter is Brahman, life is Brahman, mind is Brahman, knowledge is Brahman, bliss, delight is Brahman. This shows how in the ancient Indian concept Brahman is all pervasive. Brahman is manifest at all levels of creation or manifestation. Citing this story, Aurobindo observed that we in the East have forgotten that God exists and manifests in matter. The West has listened to this message and worshipped God in matter, and they have received the bounty of God in abundance. They have built a wonderful material civilization. We in the East may have heaped the treasures of the Spirit, but we are impoverished in the material sense. And so he called that both the East and the West have to meet and learn from each other, exchange what we would call today the technologies. And he propounded the doctrine of life divine, that life is meant to be lived in terms of God. God is to be realized and established here and not worshipped somewhere in heaven. He wrote for about 6.5 years, uninterruptedly, from 1914 to 1921, expounding this philosophy, to which we will come later in detail, establishing it in terms of scriptural values. And when he stopped after 6.5 years of continuous writing, 64 pages every month, himself typing, himself seeing the proofs. When he was asked why did he stop, he said, I could have gone on writing for another 10 years and still I would not have said even 1/7 of the knowledge that is there. But for the moment, the mind of humanity, the higher mind of humanity, cannot absorb more. That was Sri Aurobindo. He was born in 1872 in India, when the British were ruling India, and it was a fashionable pastime to imitate the British in their ways and customs. And Sri Aurobindo's father, who was a doctor, a surgeon, was an Anglophile. He desired that his children be brought up completely in the British style, and he had his young sons placed in an Irish convent in the famous hills of the Himalayas, so that the children would not be exposed to Indian influence. It was there when he was between 5 and 7, when he was sleeping in the dormitory, that he had once an experience which he records. A kind of a dark cloud came towards him and entered into him. He didn't mention it to anyone, but noted it. At the age of 7, he was taken to England and entrusted to a clergyman, Mr. Druitt in Manchester, for custody and education. The clergyman naturally tried to baptize this boy, but the boy was indifferent. He was more interested in poetry, in reading, than in matters of religion. He wrote his first poem when he was 13, and it was published in one of the notable journals, family journals of that time. He was moved to St. Paul's in London, where he showed such proficiency in Latin, in Greek, that the headmaster of the school took special pains to coach him privately, and it was a question of time before he won scholarship and moved to Cambridge. It was his father's desire that he qualified for the civil service examination, which would entitle him to occupy the highest administrative positions in India. But Sri Aurobindo was more interested in the political developments in India, where Indians were being maltreated. He was getting reports. He participated in the debates of the Indian students in Cambridge during those years. But he was, what he says, an agnostic. He had no firm belief in God or religion. It was when he was studying for this civil service examination that he had to read Dr. Max Muller's translations of the Upanishads as part of the course study in Sanskrit. And there he came across the concept of the self, the Atman. And the mind of this young boy was fascinated by the concept that there is something permanent, immutable, unchanging, eternal. And he said, this is something worth realizing in life. Thereafter, he appeared for the examination, stood high, but for some minor reason he was disqualified because they didn't want a political to form part of the civil service. And at the age of 21, after 14 years of stay in England, he returned to India. A funny thing happened, and that was, just as he was leaving England, a certain heaviness, obscurity, that had weighed upon him since the early days when that dark cloud had entered into him, it just fell off. He felt light, that the thing had gone. And when he landed in India, as soon as he touched the shores of India, in Bombay, a vast calm descended on him. There was a great silence and calm, and it continued with him for months together. He recognized it as something to do with the self, the Atman, of which he had read and which he had wanted to realize himself. Thereafter, he joined one of the princely states on the western coast of India, and he taught French in a college. He was comfortably settled. His family was 1,000 miles away in Bengal. Once, when he was driving in a horse carriage, at that time there were no motor cars. It was in the 90s of the last century. He was driving in the Broadway, and there seemed to be the possibility of an accident. He willed that there should be no accident. And to his amazement, a luminous figure emerged out of his body, mastered the situation, and the accident was averted. That was his first experience of something luminous, something godly, divine, taking shape and appearing before him. Much later, about 40 years later, he wrote about this experience in a sonnet which he called the Godhead. And here it is. I sat behind the dance of danger's fools in the shouting street that seemed a futurist's whim, and suddenly felt exceeding nature's grooves in me, enveloping me the body of him. Above my head a mighty head was seen, a face with the calm of immortality, and an omnipotent gaze that held the scene in the vast circle of its sovereignty. His hair was mingled with the sunlight breeze. The world was in his heart, and he was I. I housed in me the everlasting peace, the strength of one whose substance cannot die. The moment passed, and all was as before, only its deathless memory I bore. This is one of the autobiographical sonnets of his, many of which appear in a book entitled Sonnets. A few years later, when he had been on a visit to the mountains, the Himalayas, as he was walking on the edge of a hill, he suddenly felt that all the world had disappeared. There was only the infinite, what he calls the vacant infinite. There is an infinite full of things. There is an infinite which appears to be empty. Lot of confusion has been caused in philosophical domain by the inability of the reasoning mind, of the intellect, to understand that the infinite need not be empty. It can contain all in its bosom. It may appear to be empty. So Sri Aurobindo, as I was saying, when he was walking in the hills in Kashmir, he suddenly had this realization. Earlier, as I was describing, he had the realization of the personal Godhead. Here, an impersonal reality, nothing personal existing. It made a deep impression on him. And this too, he went on to record in a sonnet which he wrote about 40 years later. And here it is. That ridge is called the seat of Solomon, and it is where a temple installed by Shankara, the famous philosopher, stands. Describing the scene, he says, I walked on the highwayed seat of Solomon, where Shankaracharya's tiny temple stands, facing infinity from time's edge, alone on the bare ridge, ending earth's vain romance. Around me was a formless solitude. All had become one strange, unnameable, an unborn soul reality, world nude, topless and fathomless, forever still. A silence that was being's only word, the unknown beginning and the voiceless end, abolishing all things, moment seen or heard. On an incommunicable summit reigned a lonely calm and void unchanging peace on the dumb crest of nature's mysteries. It was at this time that he was involved in fomenting a revolution, a political revolution against the British rulers, a thing unheard of when you recall that India was unarmed. Nobody could possess firearms without license from the government. But he fomented and organized a network of revolutionary centers. At that time, he was told by some of his friends, highly placed friends, to take interest in yoga, spiritual matters. But Aurobindo declined. He says his primary interest was the liberation of his country and not salvation of his soul. One day, however, his younger brother, who was also involved in revolutionary activities, returned with what is called a mountain fever. It could not be cured by the doctors, and as he was sitting in the front of his house shivering, what is called a sannyasin, a renunciate. In India we have a type of renunciates who own nothing, who wear the minimum of dress, who don't stay in any place for more than 3 days, but they are always wandering minstrels. And they beg for their food. It is considered a privilege to feed them or give them something. So they just go and stand at the doorstep and call the name of God. The housewife comes forward and puts something, maybe rice or pulse or whatever it is. And after visiting 7 houses or some such number, they go back to a tank or some place, open place, and eat whatever they get. They are called sannyasis, who have renounced the world. Now, some such sannyasi came as a beggar, and when he saw this young man shivering, he asked him, "What's the matter?" He said, "I have this fever, mountain fever." He said, get me a glass of water." It was duly brought. Then he took a penknife from his pocket, from his bag, and drew 2 lines over it diagonally. He said, drink that and you will be all right tomorrow. And tomorrow he was all right. So Sri Aurobindo observed this. He said, if yoga can give me this power, well, it is something worth having. And very soon he was taught the practice of what is called pranayama. Pranayama is the technique of elongating the breath. The breathing operation is turned into a science, and regulation of breath leads to elongation of lifespan and directs the force of life energy in the different parts of the system as desired, wherever there is deficiency. So he was taught as a first step of yoga, pranayama, elongation of breath. And the first results, he was doing it for 5 to 6 hours a day. The first results, he says, poetry was his first love, right from his childhood. And he would be writing 5 or 6 lines per day. But he says after he started practicing this exercise, there was such a flow that each day he would write 200 to 250 lines. There would be a flash of light around him. Mosquitoes, do you call them mosquitoes here? Yes. Mosquitoes wouldn't touch him. They would be hovering around. There was such a charge of what you may call electricity. I don't know what it is, but the mosquitoes wouldn't bite. And that was his entry into yoga. But still, he was not a believer in worshipping God, temples, images. So one day, some friends of his, professors, high officers, they said, let us go for a walk on the river, and there are some temples we can visit. He was not interested, but as a matter of good form, he accompanied his friends, and there they went to a small temple. His friends went inside to have the worship performed by the priest, but he stood a little aloof, admiring the sculpture, the architecture, and casually his glance went to the image, the small idol of the deity, and he said that the world mother was looking at him intensely through that image, and that changed his attitude completely. And from that moment he said, God can live, God can manifest even in stone. And he wrote another sonnet on this experience of his. Says, in a town of gods, housed in a little shrine, from sculptured limbs the Godhead looked at me, a living presence, deathless and divine, a form that harbored all infinity. The great world mother and her mighty will inhabited the earth's abysmal sleep, voiceless, omnipotent, inscrutable, mute in the desert and the sky and deep. Now veiled with mind she dwells and speaks no word, voiceless, inscrutable, omniscient, hiding until our soul has seen, has heard the secret of her strange embodiment, one in the worshipper and the immobile shape, a beauty and mystery flesh or stone can drape. Thereafter, he resigned his office and delved into the political movement. He was involved in a bomb-throwing case with false charges. He was clapped in jail for 1 year. At that time he was studying the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, which is an important scripture of 700 verses. He was following the practice, the discipline. Lord Krishna is the Godhead who speaks the word and has given the Gita. One day when he was walking in the compound for his constitutional in the morning, he stood below a tree, a big tree, for shade from the sun. And as he casually looked up, he saw that the tree was not there. Instead, there was the face of the universal Godhead, Lord Krishna. He couldn't believe his eyes. He looked up again, there it was. He looked round, and on the bodies of every convict, every warden, everybody, there was the face of this God. Later in the day, he was taken to the court to stand trial, and there he felt the British judge, the British counsel, the Indian clerks, pleaders, advocates, all had the same head. That was his realization of the universal Godhead, that the divine is everywhere. You can't limit it to a particular personal form. You can't limit it to an impersonal state, but it is everywhere. Made a deep impression on him. And thereafter, he had an inner voice. When he was acquitted, he was assured from within that he would be acquitted. And on his acquittal, he was told to withdraw from politics. He was told that his assignment was changed from the liberation of his country. It was to be the liberation of man, the human. And so he quit India, British India, and sailed to a small corner in South India, Pandit, which was a French possession, as a political exile. He was 38 when he went there, leaving all the glory behind. And he just walked without a penny in his hand. He was of course received, and he went into a deep exploration of his consciousness. He had no human teacher. The only physical help that he had received from a person was 2 years before he left India. He was taken to an ordinary clerk working in a government office, who was to teach him how to meditate. So Aurobindo wanted to know how to meditate. So this young man was called, and he said to him, "Come along, you do what I say." So Aurobindo says that man was intellectually, culturally far inferior to him, but he said yes. And they went into an attic room, and there they sat for 3 days. So that gentleman told him, sit down, shut your eyes. You will see thoughts coming. Shut them out, shut them out. They say she had never heard of seeing thoughts coming. But he never thought of questioning him. And he closed his eyes, and he did see thoughts coming one after another. And he shut them out. And he says, within 3 days, the mind became completely silent. The mental operations ceased. For the rest of his life, 40 years, his mind did not function as an intellect. He said all that is said or wrote came from somewhere above the mind. The mind was only a silent transmitting instrument. That was the state, what you may call the state of nirvana of the mind. When he went to Pondicherry, he went into an exploration of his consciousness. Without a guide, he just had faith that the divine is within, and the divine guides. He entrusted himself to that inner guide and let himself be guided through many uncharted courses, not the traditional paths, but through many other courses. And at the end of 4 years, he was ready with a body of knowledge based on experience, spiritual experience, to communicate. And that was 1914. It was at this time that something very important happened in his life. And I think we will resume the thread after about 15 minutes of break. So it was that after 4 years of concentrated exploration of consciousness, he arrived at a point where things just stood. They didn't develop further. He says he did not have that knowledge which would help him to reach what he had got to others. At that time, a remarkable person came in his life, and that was whom we call today the mother. She was a French lady. She was born also in the last century in Paris, 6 years later than Sri Aurobindo, born to affluent parents, mixed parentage, Egyptian, Turkish, Portuguese, Jewish, French, all these were together. And she was to explain much later that all these were a design, that so many streams of culture had to enter, and the universal creatrix took a long time in assembling material for her being, her soul, to manifest. Now this girl, her name was Mira. Her mother was a self-proclaimed materialist and communist at that. She never believed in God or consciousness or things like that, and it was always her way of replying whenever anybody spoke of religion or God that they were fit cases for the psychiatrist. Now it is in, and her father was always, he was a banker, always interested in good, what are called the good things of life. And so this girl grew up pretty much alone. She was a little different from other children. She had a brother, but she was always introvert, never going to play with children, always sitting at home. And her mother had given her a small chair and she would always sit there. And once she described to me how at the age of 5 she started seeing a light above her head. She did not know what it was. She could not ask anybody either. So she says her child brain thought that must be God, what people call God. And from that moment, she told me, she never did a thing in her life without reference to that. It was always with her. And she was a very self-willed child. When she went to school, she showed great proficiency in art, in music, leadership. But all the while, an inner life was developing in her without her seeking. She says from the age of 11 onwards, every night, occult teachers, spirituality masters would visit her in dreams, sleep, and help her to build an inner life, some of whom she was to meet later on earth, on the physical plane. And one of them, she said, was a dark oriental figure. And though she knew very little of India at that time and Indian names, she was led to call him Krishna. I mentioned that she was a good artist, so she drew a pencil sketch of the impression of that figure and kept with her. From the age of 13, for 6 months, when she was 13, she had one experience every night, and that was the moment she closed her eyes, she would feel herself lifted, soaring above, and she had a golden robe. She would ascend and would stand above the town. Her robe would extend and cover the entire town. And when she looked down, there was a long line of old, young, men, women, children, all in distress, all had suffering on their faces. And when they came and touched the edge of the garment, they would be healed and they would go smiling. On her left, she noted, there was an old man who was encouraging her with a smile. She was later to identify him with the man of sorrows. And she says that compared to this experience, all the activities of the day seemed lifeless and uninteresting to her. She always looked forward to that experience. And she learned that to carry succor to the distressed, to heal the maimed, was one of the missions in her life. because she always had felt from the childhood that she was born with a mission, but not what was that mission was not clear. Now it started getting clear, and she knew that normal human resources were not adequate. So she developed her own practice, and by the age of 16 or 18, she established a constant communion with the presence within, the divine presence within. But what next? She did not know. At that time, she got a French translation of Swami Vivekananda's lectures in America on Raja Yoga. And she says, when she read that book, she was amazed that there could be somebody who could explain what is to be done step by step. And she says, what would have taken her years together was done in the course of a few months. A little thereafter, a French translation of the Bhagavad Gita was placed in her hands by an Indian, and he told her, regard Lord Krishna as the indweller in you and surrender to him. She did likewise, and she said within a month the whole thing was done. And by the time she was 20 or 21, she already had experienced many powers, occult, out of the body experience and things like that. But she knew there was a science behind it, and she was interested in developing this side of life in order to manifest the divine for the betterment of humanity. At that time, she came to know by a series of coincident circumstances a Polish Jew who called himself Theon. He was a master of occultism, and he had a wife from the Isle of Wight, an English lady who was even more developed. And both of them were working in their own way to hasten the advent of the truth, to hasten the new age. And when Mira met them, naturally they got interested in each other, and she followed them to Algeria in North Africa, where the Theons had a villa and where he was practicing his own discipline. She went there and she learned a good deal. She went with Theo. She was a very young girl, must be about 21, 22. He was in the middle of his life. So as he walked to his bungalow in those Algerian mountains, there was nobody else. She was following him. They had just arrived. He turned back and told her, look, I can do whatever I want with you now. She just stood firm and said, you can't. That man became red. How do you say that? He said, the divine is here. You can't do that. He immediately turned his face and walked into the house. She followed. Thereafter, Mira came into closer contact with his wife and learned many things from her. One of which was that lady could come out of her body 12 times, come out of the body leaving the physical sheath, come out again and leave the subtle physical sheet, leave the life sheet, and so on. 12 times till she could enter into the world where there are no forms. And Meera learned that technique of leaving her body at will and going to that world where forms are not yet, the source of things. And this lady who was teaching Mother, Meera, was so proficient, that once she was fatigued. These experiences and exercises, these occult, they exhaust the body terribly. Life energy is sucked out, and unless one replenishes oneself with universal energies or divine energies, one collapses soon. So one day she was fatigued. So she called Meera. She said, look, she brought a grapefruit. In those countries, grapefruits are bigger than what we get here. And she lay down and kept the grapefruit on her abdomen. And she said, you come back after 45 minutes. And when Meera went back after 45 minutes, she saw that the grapefruit had sunk to the size of a lemon. But her face was blooming, full of energy. And that is how she learned to take the minimum of food, but always draw from the universal life energies. She would say even later, 50 years later to us, that if I take food, it is out of respect for the law of matter. I really don't need it. So she would take a half cup of fruit juice or something like that. But she had the art of drawing energies. So after completion of one such session, when they were returning by ship, at that time there were no planes, returning by ship to France from Algeria, there was a huge storm. All people who were on the deck came down. The captain shook his head and he said anything might happen. Theo called her, Meera, he said, you go and stop that storm. So she went up. The deck was deserted. She left, she came out of her physical body and went into the region where all these spirits and elves and gnomes who govern the storm phenomena are there. And they were hugely enjoying the disorder. The waves coming up and all that, they were waiting for the ship to sink and enjoy themselves. So she said, what are you doing here? Stop it. And they stopped. Everything became serene, the boat reached. That was the background, occult background that she had. Now her husband, Paul Richard by name, he was a brilliant man. And he was also in politics. So he happened to come to India just at the time when Sri Aurobindo reached French India. He came to canvass votes for a certain friend of his to the French Senate from French Indian electorate. So when he came, he asked people, we always hear of wise people from India. Are there any wise people here? They said, yes, we have just received somebody. And they took him to Sri Aurobindo. He was amazed that there could be an Indian in this corner of the country with such a grasp over world affairs, such brilliant intellect. And he talked. And then he remembered and he asked. He said, because he knew the spiritual background, he said, my wife gets certain visions. She is practicing on spiritual things. And she always sees a lotus in her visions. What does it mean? So Sri Aurobindo told him a lotus represents the blossoming human consciousness, opening up at the touch of the divine truth, the ray of truth. Then he asked, she also sees what is called the Star of David. It is the Jewish symbol, two triangles, one pointing upwards, one pointing downwards. So what does that mean? She sees it frequently. She said the upward triangle represents the aspiration, the movement upwards of matter, life and mind. The descending triangle is the response of the grace of Sat Chit Ananda, existence, consciousness and bliss. And both meeting, intersection, there is a perfect square. Square symbolizes perfect creation. So it is as a result of the upward aspiration of earth and the downward descent of the higher truth, higher consciousness, that a perfect world will be formed. So he went and told his wife that he has met so and so, and he has interpreted your constant that way. She was very much interested, and she said, next time you go to India, I would like to come and meet him, because she had a vague feeling that this may be the person with whom I have to work. So 4 years later the opportunity came, and she came to India in 1914. And as the train coming to Pondicherry was coming for a few miles away, she saw from the center of the town where Sri Aurobindo lived, a huge column of light going into the sky. She felt this is an indication that the spiritual personality with whom I have to work must be there. So she came, and when she went to Sri Aurobindo, she saw the face exactly as she had sketched years and years earlier, and that sketch is still there. All of us have got copies of that sketch. And she met Sri Aurobindo, and she says she had so many plans. She just sat by his side, sat at his feet, though there was a chair, and she went into a kind of trance. She said she had always tried her best to silence the mind, but it was not possible. That day, the mind became completely still, and all the plans, all the programs, all the ideas that she had for the rejuvenation of humanity, for the mission for mankind and all of them went, and it was a blank slate. They met again and found that they had similar ideals, same approach, believing in this world, that the time is ripe for a new advent of the divine glory, that unity of mankind, a new word, a new consciousness has to replace the old. And that was the ideal towards which these two were working, aspiring in different parts of the globe. That was how she met Sri Aurobindo. And Sri Aurobindo says, she was asked, what was your reaction when you saw her? He said, till I saw her, I never could imagine that surrender to the divine could be worked out to the last cell in the body. He had never seen that surrender of the cells in the body to the divine worked out in the manner that had been worked out in her. So both of them, she, her husband and Sri Aurobindo, started a philosophical journal, French and English, called the Arya. Arya, he says, does not mean what Hitler means, but an aspiring, an upward working soul. Anybody who works to go up, he is the Arya. Anybody who decays, he is an Anarya. So it was there that he propounded his philosophy of life divine, that all of us are involved in a dynamic process of evolution. The divine is manifesting. We are in a mid stage. Something yet is to come. That the mind has to be replaced by a still higher consciousness. The truth mind, the mind of the intellect, has to yield to the mind of truth, as a result of which all suffering, all pain, all evil will be displaced. They would recede. Ignorance would be replaced by knowledge. And he developed his philosophy of evolution of consciousness for the first time. And then he worked out a discipline to translate that philosophy into practice, called the synthesis of yoga. And he examined also the political development of humanity to see whether this vision of a spiritual age, spiritual consciousness, applies only to the individual or to the collectivity of man. And he wrote Ideal of Human Unity. Sociological development he studied of the world, and he wrote series of articles, Psychology of Social Development, which later he changed into Human Cycle. Then he casually looked up into the old Indian scriptures to see if his vision, if his experience had any support. And that is how he wrote The Secret of the Veda, the Upanishads, the Tantras, the essays of the Gita, and so on. But in the very first month, the First World War broke out, and Mira and her husband had to return to Europe because he was conscripted in the army. Thereafter, she went to Japan in 1916 and stayed there for 4 years, where she had certain wonderful realizations of Japanese art, of how the Japanese race represented the aesthetic soul of the world. Japanese at that time are different from Japanese today. And in 1920, after the end of the war, she came to India and joined Sri Aurobindo. And she was living in the same household along with other disciples, helping them. And it was in 1926 that Sri Aurobindo had a very special kind of experience, realization of the descent of the cosmic consciousness in his physical body. Cosmic consciousness normally comes in the mind, but he got it in the physical body. It is called the descent of the overmental consciousness, represented by Lord Krishna. And that opened the door for his further project of aspiring for, working for the descent of the supermind, what is called the truth mind, the divine mind. And he completely retired from public contact. A small community had already started growing around him, but it was disorganized. But he asked Mira to take charge and look after the collectivity. And he told his disciples that hereafter she is your spiritual mother. And all my help will be reached to you through her. People asked, why is she our mother? She is a foreign lady. Why should we accept her as the mother? I would go into that aspect in my talk on Sunday at the fellowship, because it will be more apposite at that time. So that is how the Sri Aurobindo ashram started. Sri Aurobindo was not happy with the word ashram, because in India an ashram has come to mean a kind of a monastery, a kind of a place where all renunciates gather. He says, my vision is not to renounce life, but to live life. All life is yoga. Everything must be stabilized and established here. but then he took it in the old sense, Vedic sense of the house of a teacher. And that was how Sri Aurobindo Ashram started in 1926 with about 15 or 20 people, and gradually developed. She developed it, the mother developed it. Till now we are about 2,000 people there, living permanently, people from about 20 to 25 countries. And Sri Aurobindo passed away in 1950. All the while he was very active, working 8 to 10 hours per day, answering letters, corresponding, guiding people. But she was more readily accessible to all of us. So most of us had relation and interchange with the mother, and indirectly with Sri Aurobindo. He passed away in 1950. She passed away in 1973. For 23 years she continued and did achieve certain significant advances in the evolution of consciousness for humanity. That will be another occasion to talk about it. And afterwards, the spiritual afflatus is such. What Sri Aurobindo and Mother have established by way of their work and presence is such that the community has continued to live and function for the last 8 years without a head, without a director. It is the first time that 2,000 people are living together in complete harmony, without friction. A spiritual democracy, a real democracy where there is no hate. A few years before she passed away, the mother also launched what is called a planetary city, called Aurobindo, the city of dawn. She said the ashram has now reached its optimum strength. It was a yogic institution. We have tried to build a spiritual pattern of society based upon collaboration, friendly dealings, not upon competition, not upon rivalry, no hierarchy, but a commonality. And she was satisfied with certain results of this 50-year-old experiment. And she said, now let us extend this without imposing the yogic discipline on the people. Let us offer it as a pattern for humanity. Let us see how it works out. So she started Aurobindo, the city of dawn, where she invited people from all over the world who were prepared to cut off their moorings with the past and live practicing the ideal of human unity and the development of consciousness, God words, divine words. And there was a big response. About 500 people have gathered from 20 countries. We have about 17 or 18 settlements, orchards, agricultural farms, industries, education, culture, different units, all split up into small settlements. Naturally, in an experiment like that, a pioneering experiment, there are difficulties, and we are having a number of teething troubles. But I have found wherever I have gone in the world, everybody looks to that experiment in Aurobindo, how it is going. Because every New Age community in this country or in Europe is faced with certain problems. They want to know how we are facing the problems there. Well, ultimately it is everybody has to share, and many such experiments have to be made before a new humanity, a new pattern of living becomes possible. But the United Nations, they are sending their study teams to Aurobindo to see how things are being built. The emphasis there is spiritual. A person must be spiritual and ready to exceed his ego and desire before one can be fit to live in a new community. That is mother's vision. And the government of India has taken special interest in this as its major contribution to the world peace. So this is, I have given you a kind of an outline of Sri Aurobindo's work, mother's work, because it is very important, because he said he never received help from any human being except the mother. And he regarded her very highly. And personally, people like me, we have all been molded only by the mother. Her consciousness, her thing is still living to us. And we have no successor to her in our ashram, because there can be no successor. She was a very outgoing woman, full of cheer, full of jokes, full of happiness, never solemn, never serious. She would always pull our legs if we were serious or depressed. If we were very much depressed, she would say, look, you know what is depression? Depression is acute egoism. And so on. Volumes could be written about her. They are being written. She was what you may call a divine consciousness in action. Moment to moment, moment to moment. She said she wouldn't write. She had no philosophy. She was interested only in living the light. She never wrote a book. But her answers to questions, her talks with people, they have filled 15 volumes. Her letters, they are still filling many volumes. Her paintings. And she had a grasp for economics. Higher mathematics was her special subject. Her brother was in Polytechnic in Paris, and she had higher mathematics in his engineering. To help him in his homework, she took interest and studied higher mathematics. She studied languages. She studied Sanskrit from Sri Aurobindo. She studied Chinese when she was in China, a bit of Japanese. And she approached the government of India once to give her dual citizenship. She said, though I am French by birth, I am an Indian by predilection. I would like to have the Indian citizenship, but without giving up the French citizenship. Government was alarmed. They said, how can you do that? If tomorrow there is a war, on what side are you going to be? She said, it is precisely to avoid the eventuality of a contingency of war that I am pleading for a dual citizenship, which should develop into multi-citizenship later on. But they were not ready. And I suppose many things are like that, which are not, their time has not yet come, but she has shown the way. And she has established Sri Aurobindo's teaching solidly. Sri Aurobindo himself says, but for her, Mira, my philosophy would have been theoretical, would have remained theoretical. She demonstrated that it could be worked in practice. Now, what is that philosophy? What impact can it have on our lives? What aspects of life it touches? In what way it is integral? In what way it is holistic? In what way he has anticipated the recent advances, including Teilhard de Chardin? And in what way the world thought is moving towards the vision that he has anticipated? Well, these are things that we will be touching or dwelling upon during our subsequent sessions. And now I would be happy to answer questions. I think I have talked enough. You might ask me any question.
Pandit, you mentioned two experiences in Sri Aurobindo's life, one of the personal Godhead,
Yes.
and then this later experience of the vacant fast. Can you say something about how that shaped his experience of his knowledge of what God is?
Yes, it convinced him that the divine reality can reveal itself in any form, in any way, with form or without form. You can't limit its way of being or becoming. What he develops in the life divine, being and becoming, and he explains, when you say non-existence, it does not mean it does not exist, but it means it exceeds the determination by existence. It is not a negative term. So his whole outlook is universal. He conceives of the divine reality in three statuses: transcendent, beyond everything; universal, pervading everything; individual, stationed in the individual scheme. The divine can be experienced in an impersonal peace, joy, knowledge. It can be experienced in a personal form. It can be experienced in a universal form. Now all these three or four major experiences built that look in him that you can't limit the divine expression. Because in India it is a big deal. There are people who swear only by the impersonal. They say the personal is an inferior way. There are persons who say the personal is the highest, impersonal is only a state of being. So the warfare goes on. So he says no, simultaneously all these things can be. Sri Aurobindo was the first person to say that all this warfare is intellectual, dialectics. In spiritual experience, all these things find their just proportion and place. All are possible. So that's what he says. No philosophy, no spiritual ideology is false. Everything has its foundations and basis. Only when you say this only, you are wrong. And he says, my moment of truth came, my moment of knowledge came when I realized that the opposite of truth is not falsehood but another truth. He records somewhere.
There's some deeper truth. This just occurs to me tonight because the last word and then whether you separate the 4 years
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think they didn't mention anything about it.
Was it ever a source of anguish or anything?
For mother, yes. Yes. Because in her prayers and meditations, she constantly mentions what an anguish it was for her. Having come to the harbor again to get back, she mentions that, she records. But Sri Aurobindo was so impersonal in his dealings, he never mentioned these things. He was highly impersonal. Sri Aurobindo, you could rarely establish contact with him on a personal basis. Highly impersonal. Mother was personal, though at times she could be impersonal. So I suppose both are complementary sides of a manifesting truth. She was a Shakti, a concept which we will develop on Sunday. I hope some of these friends will come there. 11 o'clock. What is the concept of the Divine Mother?
The Divine Mother.
Yes.
Did Mother ever impart to anybody this occult teachings and powers?
She invited. She said in one of the meetings at the playground that anybody who wants to learn, she would teach. So the next day a lot of people said, I want to learn, I want to learn. Then she said, yes, but there is one condition. First you must give up fear completely. When you have given up fear, you come and tell me, I will teach you. But nobody came thereafter. She said, when you go into those worlds, all of them come on you and all kinds of things. If there is a slightest element of fear, you are finished. You must have that faith that the divine is with me, or I have the divine protection, nothing can happen to me. Unless you can develop it and fix it in your waking life, it is a very dangerous thing. But of course she discouraged. She said it is the spiritual consciousness that is more important than occult power. When you are spiritually developed, if occult powers are necessary for you, the divine gives it to you. They form by themselves. But to develop occult powers for sake of occult powers is not desirable. They just come as a corollary of development of consciousness. The powers take birth.
In this country at the present time, there's a great deal of interest in experimenting out of the body.
Yes.
Regressing to past lives and all sorts of things like that. And a great many seminars and different with considerable success. And many people do experience like induced by doing hypnosis. But she didn't do anything like that.
No, because spiritually, hypnosis is very undesirable. It is the imposition of one will over another. It interferes with the freedom of the soul to develop and progress in its own way. As a medical therapy, it's another matter. But otherwise, to use hypnosis is very unspiritual. And she always advised against it. Similarly, regression, it is against the law of nature. It is a providential arrangement in nature that we don't remember our past. The load of the present is enough. To have complications of last birth is very unsettling. In one of the seminars that I conducted last month or so in Northwest Seattle at Antioch University, there was a woman who told us that she looked a bit disordered, Then when you closely question, she said in 1930 she had a car accident. She died in a motor accident. And the angels came to take her. But she wouldn't go because she was in love with a man. And without bidding goodbye to him, she didn't want to go. So they took her to that man. She bid goodbye. And then she followed. They took. But she was so earthbound that she could not go up. Here. That man must be very old now. 1930 means you can imagine. Isn't it? But all those things, unsatisfied, frustrations, they interfere. So she goes from teacher to teacher, from one system to another, doesn't get peace. And it was a relief to her when I said that you should not remember. You should forget the past. Look to the future, not the past. past is illusion, it must be forgotten. Live a normal life. Past can never come back. Now, so this regression has done great harm to people, even as the newly popular game of contacting spirits and taking down what the spirits say, that also is very dangerous, misleading. Even great intellectuals, they are writing books as dictated by so and so, so and so. Somebody pretends to be Christ, somebody pretends to be Buddha, somebody pretends to be another angel. These are masquerading. Sri Aurobindo has written a lot about it, Mother has written a lot about these experiences and why they should not be done.
There's a passage in the mother's diary about very old experiences that she'd forgotten and never thought she would remember again, suddenly as a period resurfacing. And it was as though in her analysis of it, she said that the karma, the lesson in life that had to be learned from that experience was finally understood. And at that point, the old memory came back with a bitter farewell.
I see.
A number of these paraded bodies. You could understand with each one what the lesson was that had been learned that allowed her to let go of it. It seemed like a much different relationship to the past.
Yes.
When you say Sri Aurobindo was impersonal, what exactly do you mean?
That is, he didn't have personal relationships. Even with his wife when she was there in his political days, or later with all 2,000 people of us and 10,000 people around, he didn't have personal relationship with anybody. He was always untouched and unmoved. There was no involvement in a personal way. He was not affected in a personal way. He would try to do something, it didn't work. He was quite calm and peaceful. Important things. So, what we call it was an impersonal personality. Yes, he was playing. And they were really past birth relationships. Those people with whom he took those things, liberties and things like that, whether it was to Dilip Kumar Roy or Nirobharan and a few people, they were past birth connections. There is hardly a subject in spiritual or occult matters which they have not touched. Sri Aurobindo or Mother. Only we must know where to find it. Hardly an experience. Yes. I brought some catalogues and things, I didn't bring it today, tomorrow I'll bring for the class and distribute them. They will get an idea of the books, various literature. I've got enough. We'll bring this stand tomorrow. We were just speaking before Bina came of what solid work has been done by you and Dr. Haridas in putting Sri Aurobindo on the map here. And we have seen how he is not known enough in other parts of the country. If you go to Boulder, if you go to Florida, they don't know. Somebody vaguely recollects he is a Hindu philosopher who spoke of evolution. That's all.
I'm sorry, I was late. I was in the meeting.
I think it has been recorded, no? This time. Yes. Yeah. It is true, it is true. You see, because the current Christian dogma, after all, this is a Christian country, exposed to Christian thought, and till the 6th century, I think, the Christian church accepted incarnation, reincarnation. And after that, the Swami Kriyananda, autobiography of Western Yogi I mentioned to you, he has collected data, is written in the book, how there was a special council meeting in Constantinople or somewhere, where the Pope did not participate, but the other cardinals and others, they held a meeting, and for political purposes or something, they said hereafter this reincarnation should be rejected. Rejected. Since then, right, yes. And since then, the Christian church is not, but even now, in the monasteries and things, in the higher grades of the clergy, they still believe it is for the laity that reincarnation is not permitted, because it strikes against the whole root of baptism and going to the paradise next the moment you die and all that. But the thing is, if you accept the theory of creation, that God has created this and that's it, then it's a different matter. But if you say that evolution is the law, development of consciousness, then reincarnation becomes a corollary. You can't complete the evolution in one birth. It has to take a series of births. So once you accept evolution, that's why the church does not accept evolution. And Teilhard de Chardin had got into so much trouble because of his theory of evolution. Evolution strikes at the root of creation theory. We in India also, we speak of creation at one level, but another level we speak of parinama, development, changing, cycles, things like that. So, but gradually I find there is a change in the atmosphere in the West. They are accepting it now. A lot of literature has come of after death survival, and people are beginning to accept. There is resistance, but so many have broken away from the Orthodox Church, and they are believing there is no escape from it.
But could you make more distinction here? Because it seems to me in the West, a lot of the popular notion about reincarnation is not valid. It's as though this personality I have now will continue.
No, it can't.
No. So will you say?
Yes, it is.
Clarify that.
Each, you see, what incarnates, what takes birth, is the soul. The soul has taken millenniums to develop to this human stage, and at the human soul also it takes on numberless births, taking a new personality in every birth. Sri Aurobindo explains in The Riddle of the World how John Balbus is not born John Balbus the next birth. He is somebody else, Peter somebody. So there is no point in repeating this personality in my next birth. So he says, one who is a king, who has exercised sovereignty, dominion, He may choose to be a cobbler in the next birth, to have the experience of humility, humbleness, service. So every birth, the experience that is chosen by the soul is different. And all these varied experiences total up in giving stature, maturity to the soul till it unites with the divine consciousness. But each birth is, you have a different personality, different experience. But something of the past, karma, that enters into the new situation. So karma is a process of the machinery of rebirth. But there is a lot of freedom of soul. The soul can accept its fate, it can refuse. That's what Sri Aurobindo says in Savitri. I am quoting from Savitri because it is so pithy, It is so pithy. There are many passages in Savitri which sum up a whole philosophy in one line. Yes. Our present fate, child of past energies, he says. Child of past energies. Our past lurks at our knees. Wherever you go, it lurks there. First is inconscient. It is the densest layer of our unconscious realm in this philosophy. And refusal to change its law. Refusal to move. Refusal to accept the light. These are some of the main things with which it constantly repels any effort to change. It is only by working upon it again and again, reaching the light, putting the pressure, that a slow opening has to be made. And Mother saw in her experiments on her own body that the cells of the body have been accustomed for millenniums to obey the law of birth, growth, death. He says they have to be converted, coaxed, educated, and got to accept a new law, change their loyalty and accept a new law of birth, growth and endless growth. And she tried. She saw that there were millions of cells, but there are groups, and she would work upon the groups. First there would be tremendous resistance, and that would be translated as severe pain in the body. The doctors around her would insist on giving her some tablets, but she said, it has nothing to do with this physical thing, please don't force me to take medicines. And after working upon it, when the cells consented to change, she said, there would be tremendous joy, the bliss that I can't bear in this body. So there are hundreds and hundreds of such groups. One has to work patiently. And it was in the midst of that process that her body disintegrated, and she had to call halt to that experiment. She said it is very difficult because it is an age-old law that you are going to change. It takes time. And she said, you don't have human conceptions of time. You should live in eternity to do this. Somebody has to do. So what has been done is a landmark. Next person will have to continue from there. It is like solving problems, equations, geometrical things. After that one has to pursue.
not a personal thing.
No, you are right. The Buddhist philosophy itself is that they don't accept that there is a soul. There is a continuity. It is a continuity is of action and reaction. There is a sequence forged by desire, and you have an illusion of fixity. So if you cut at the root of desire, everything collapses and there is nothing. There is no soul, there is no God. That was the original thing, And now in Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism and all that, they have made it a ritual religion and added many other features. But essentially Buddhism as it has come down meant there is no soul, anatta, and there is no God as we conceive. But in the other traditions, the soul is. If God is, soul is. A spark of God is there as your soul, and that is immortal. It starts with a spark, it slowly develops, it becomes an entity. In a plant, in an animal, it is just a spark. It is more as a presence than as a being. So at the human level, in the Tantras it is said 84 lakhs of births are required before the soul arrives at a human level. But it is a way of putting, saying that the innumerable births have to pass. But the soul, it carries, as you say, the essence of the experience of every birth. Not all details, but the essence of the experience is assimilated, and that adds to the stature or the growth of the soul. So you will see highly developed persons, highly evolved persons, they have always multiple personalities. He may be an artist, he may be a poet, he may be something else, not just one. So you can always be sure when a person has many personalities, that is a highly developed person. Napoleon, he was an administrator, he was a jurist, he was a military man, he was so many things. Churchill, Winston Churchill, who died, English Prime Minister, he was also a multiple personality.
Is it possible that someone is able to clarify what stands in the way of having access to more universal, let's say the latest that's been accomplished in different areas by different religious organizations, and I think again that is how personal is the soul?
Soul is always personal.
It is
Self is impersonal. The Atman.
I wonder about the soul.
Soul is an entity, developing entity, growing in evolution. It is personal. Your soul is different from mine, but the self that supports you is the same as myself. The soul, you can say, is a projection of the self in evolution. That is what Sri Aurobindo and the mother called the psychic being. It is a developing proposition, and naturally it will follow your personal line of evolution. Each one, mother says, is meant to express a different stress of the eternal consciousness. No two individuals can be alike. No two individual souls have the same destiny, because when they are emanated, each one carries a different stress, and that is the real idea of which I am going to speak tomorrow in the Life Divine, discussing what is the real idea, that each person carries that image, that vision of what is to be ultimately in himself, in some level. That's the truth. Divine personality, universal you mean, or the individual? Yes, it is there. It is there. Though many of them, yes, there are in the Vaishnava teachings, particularly in Bengal, Chaitanya, Nadia and all that, it is the divine indweller. You grow and join the Purushottama.
Is that more developed in the residents of personality?
Yes, you see, in the Indian thought, it is the divine person. You in the West speak of personality. Personality is something that emerges as a result of accretion and adding many things to the individual existent. Is that right? So in the East, this personality aspect would be devalued. But Sri Aurobindo gives value to it as a contributory element to the eventual emergence of the total person. For him also, personality is secondary to the person. Personality is a changing phenomenon. From birth to birth, the personality changes. The constituents of personality change. I don't know exact connotation in the West, but he makes a distinction between person and personality.
It almost seems that the difference is that the path involves a fulfillment of personality to reach personhood. That rather than denying some aspect of it or renouncing it outwardly, it's lived to its fullest in life, and that somehow that is a faith that will lead to this kind of person.
His position is, I believe, that a number of personalities culminate in the plenary personhood. Number of personalities. And they are all present in essence. Each personality that you develop is not gone with death. Something of it remains. Something of the poet, something of the artist, something of the scholar or writer, all that remains in some form in the ultimate person. I think we shouldn't exhaust everything one day.